Okay, I'm not sure if any of you here have heard anything about this, but to be completely honest, the people who lived around the lake here, myself included, are beyond terrified. Even if we don't say it outright, it's not a new occurrence. Stories about it have circulated at least since I was a small boy. And according to the old-timers who still remain, perhaps even longer. But the last year or so, and especially the last 6 months, it's really gotten bad. For anyone unfamiliar with the area, and contrary to its name, the Salton Sea isn't an actual ocean, but a large saltwater lake located in Southern California. Millions of years ago, there used to periodically be a giant lake here which would swallow the whole valley up. But the Salton Sea, as it's known today, was created by a dam bursting on the Colorado River over a century ago. It was once touted as a miracle in the desert and attracted tourists and vacationers from everywhere to swim, boat, and fish in its waters. But thanks to a number of disasters, both natural and man-made, by the 70s and 80s, it had been reduced to a shell of its former self. Only those too stubborn or too sentimental to leave remained. And in the following decades, other people soon came to live on the shores of the lake. Those who saw it as an artistic refuge from the outside world, or those who weren't in the best financial situation. Nowadays, its biggest claims to fame are an early 2000s movie starring Val Kilmer, and having a fictional version of it in a very famous video game. Like I said though, if you ask the real old-timers, the few who still live here who were around during the sea's glory days, they'll tell you that it's always been here, living beneath the water's surface. Nobody ever bothered to give it a name. In those days, the year-round residents feared that word might get around and scare away the tourists. They couldn't risk the lifeblood of the 5 towns that rest on both sides of the lake disappearing into the ether. And so, whenever somebody went missing, be it a tourist who just so happened to never come up after diving under the water, or whose empty boat was found floating abandoned far from shore, a fishing rod still in the holder, and a smear of blood on the gunwale, they would cover it up. Eventually, they would all end up as files in the unsolved cold cases department of the police station. And since the disappearances were seldom, birds seemed to have disappeared the majority of the time, nobody outside of the community ever bothered to dig deeper. As I was born decades later, I didn't hear about it until I was a little kid. Growing up in what was left of Bombay Beach in the early 90s, it was a stern warning my mother and father always told me. Now you get your behind back here before dark, Jim, and stay away from the water's edge on your way home. When I asked them why, they refused to say anymore, only remained adamant for me to stay away. Naturally, as I was a rebellious 10-year-old boy, the first chance I ever got, I ignored their rules and stood by the water's edge as the sun lowered on the horizon. That was the first time I ever saw it. I had been watching a heron fly over the water's edge when my attention was caught by a ripple about 20 feet from shore. At first, I thought it was just one of the last remaining fish still in the lake, or more likely, a trick of the fading light. But when it came again, closer this time, I focused completely on it. A third ripple. This time, more violent, came from less than 15 feet away from where I stood. And almost like precognition, I suddenly felt an almost sickening sense of dread and terror overtake me. Goosebumps rose on my arms, and even in the sweltering heat, I felt a chill shudder through me. I began backing away from the lapping water, feeling very much like the worm on the end of a hook that has just seen the fish which will end its existence approach. And then, its head broke the water surface. In the last rays of sunlight that preceded the beginning of night, I couldn't make out its features that well. But if you want a general idea of what it looked like, take the monsters from The Creature from the Black Lagoon and humanoids from the Deep movies, splice them together, and then imagine that hell itself took a few extra minutes effort and spat out the amalgamation. The biggest thing I can remember was its eyes. 2 glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce right into your soul, attempting to root you to the spot and unable to flee. I felt myself begin to tremble as I watched it study me, the same way a shark eyes a young seal pup. And had it not been for what happened next, I doubt I would be here today. As I watched it begin to stand up, still unable to move. The sudden loud explosion of what I can only assume was a firework of some sort, likely set off by one of the bored and rowdy teens that lived a little ways down from me, pierced the air. The sound froze the creature in place, and I saw its head swivel around to try and locate its source. At the same time, it finally seemed to break the spell, and without another look to see what it was doing, I turned and ran towards home, screaming. When I burst through the front door, I saw my mother and father spin around to face me. I saw my mother's face go pale as she saw the terrified expression on my face, and my father was a blur of motion in an instant, sprinting past me to lock the door and slam the window shut. Mom knelt down beside me, wrapping me in the tightest hug she ever gave me. I could feel the hot tears dripping down onto my cheek. I never again disobeyed my parents. As the years went by and the dawn of the new millennium rounded the corner, the stories of it kept making the rounds around us locals. After my 21st birthday, I would hear them the most in the Ski Inn, one of the 2 bars in town, spoken in hushed, drunken whispers so as not to attract the attention of the occasional out-of-towner who happened to wander in. My father died of cancer in 2004, and my mother seeming to give up on life without him by her side when just 4 years later. For a time, I seriously thought about selling our home and simply moving somewhere else. Between what my parents had left me and the money I made working construction on a casino that had recently opened nearby, I had enough to take my belongings and start anew somewhere else. Somewhere where there was less crime, less dead fish, and most importantly, without the looming specter that dwelt below the surface. But whether it was a stupid sense of loyalty to the memories that linger in the house, fear of leaving the only place I'd ever known, or even defiance, a refusal to allow it to make me turn tail and run, I stayed, just like the old-timers and the others who slowly moved in to take their place when they died, and things continued on as normal as they could. Until rather recently, that is. You see, without the Colorado River replenishing it, and with farmers conserving more water, not allowing it to run off like before, the Salton Sea is beginning to shrink, slowly but steadily. There are efforts to try and save it, if nothing else but for the birds which still live on its shores, and to keep the toxic dust clouds from filtering up from the bottom of the lake, from blowing over the towns and into the nearby cities like Los Angeles. But it hasn't stopped it completely, and that seems to have made the creature far more aggressive. The last couple of years, the rate of people disappearing around the sea has increased drastically. What once used to be only 1 or 2 every 5 or 6 years has multiplied exponentially. They're never dug into too deeply, as many decades ago before. After all, with the reputation the area has, most assumed that they were victims of either drug violence or robberies gone wrong, and they were buried somewhere out in the desert. Things like gunshots are ignored by people out here at this point. As much as we wish we could get help, everyone here knows that nobody would believe any of us. It would be written off as the hallucinations of a drug addict or alcoholic, or simply the fantasies of someone with too much free time on their hands. And because it was hushed up for so long, as horrible as I know it is to say, many simply find it easier to continue the cycle than to break it. The same way some towns never spoke up when cults moved into them. But I can no longer keep quiet, not after what happened to old Fred. Old Fred was a vagrant, albeit a friendly and polite one who wandered around the Salton Sea for as long as I can remember. He was in his 70s, at least, with white hair that stuck out like Doc Brown's from Back to the Future, and eyes that held the same wildness as a Mustang. Every few months, I'd see him roll into town on his usual circular path. Usually, he would find one of the abandoned buildings to hole up in for the night. I never asked him if he'd heard the stories or seen the creature himself. I can only assume he did. That's why, one extremely hot summer night a few months ago, as I lay in bed with the fan on full blast, trying to wrestle sleep from the grasp of the Sandman, I sat bolt upright as I heard his drunken shouts coming from outside. I couldn't be sure, but from the sounds of things, He was down near the far end of town, down near the water. "Oh, you've gotta be shitting me," I hissed, throwing the covers off me and leaping out of bed as the realization slammed home. I felt the same fear that I had as a child rear its head at me, like a monster from under the bed. But I forced it away as I yanked on my jeans and a shirt. "Fred, you seriously should know better than this, drunk or not," I whispered to myself as I jammed my work boots on. Reaching under the bed, I pulled my keys from my belt as I pulled the lockbox out. Not long after my mother had died, I had bought myself a revolver. It was partly for protection in case some fried-out whack job tried breaking in, and partly as an insurance policy in case I ever found myself face-to-face with it again. Pulling the gun from the lockbox, I quickly slid 6 rounds from an ammo box into the gun. I shoved at least a dozen more into my pants pocket and jammed the revolver into my waistband. Snatching a flashlight off the kitchen counter, I slid the deadbolt back on the front door. I felt my heart thundering in my chest, and for a moment, the temptation to simply lock the door again and ignore everything overwhelmed me. I took a deep breath and turned the handle, stepping out into the night. The stench of the lake hit my nostrils as I descended the stairs. And, moving as quietly as I could, I headed across the street and down the block. There were no cars on the roads, and as far as I could tell, nobody else awake. Aside from the hum of the occasional streetlight I sprinted under, the sound of a bird calling from somewhere far off, and the low but steady howl of the wind, it was silent. Silent, that is, except for the yells of Fred, who I was sure now was over the sand wall and down near the water's edge. "I swear, I'm going to wring your damn neck, old man." I hustled past the darkened shape of the old drive-in theater, my footsteps now in lockstep with my heartbeat. Each step I took towards the increasing stench of the water intensified the childhood memory that kept replaying itself in the back of my mind. A minute or so later, and the last of the nearby buildings fell away behind me as I approached 5th Street, stopping to catch my breath for a moment. I snapped on the flashlight and shone it around. The street was empty, as was the narrow dirt road that led over the ditch to the water. I strained my ears to listen. For a moment, there was silence, and I hoped against hope that old Fred has grown enough common sense to move away from the lake while I'd been running. But any such notions were dashed as I heard the loudest shout yet come from the other side of the ditch. I couldn't make any individual words out, but the voice was unmistakably his. I inhaled sharply through my nostrils. Fuck. I practically spat the last swear out as my course was set for me. Feeling my mouth go as dry as cotton, I forced a shaky breath from between my lips and then jogged up the road to the top. There was no moon or stars out tonight, and it meant the sand and muck that led to the water's edge was cast in almost complete darkness. Forcing myself to stay calm, and with my eyes dotting around every direction possible, I slowly descended the dirt path until I stood on level ground again. The stench was almost unbearable now being so close, and I gagged for a moment before forcing the whisper out. "Fred?" Nobody answered. I forced myself to raise my voice slightly. "Fred?" I thought I heard the sound of shuffling feet for a moment. My free hand dropped to rest on the butt of the revolver. But again, aside from a slight increase in the howling wind, nothing. I raised my voice to a rough shout, a pang of irritation almost overwhelming with tension and fear coursing through my veins. "Fred, for fuck's sake, answer me, dumbass." Fuck you, prick." The slurred, raspy voice of a man who smoked one too many cigarettes in his life, on top of being plastered, came from in front of me to the left. Jerking my flashlight up, I focused the beam and breathed a sigh of relief as I saw the man stumbling about 50 feet away. With a slight increase in anxiety, I noticed he was almost walking directly in the water. But after a quick, cursory look around, felt a small sense of relief wash over me as I saw he looked to be fine. Letting the irritation finally win out, I began to stride towards him. "Fred, what the hell are you doing down here?" I growled at him. "You know better than to wander near the water at night, just like the rest of us, especially drunk off your ass. If you fell in and passed out, you could drown." Fred snorted in a way that told me He didn't give a hoot. "I do what I fucking want, whippersnapper," he managed out, flipping the bird. "And I don't want your damn pity." I felt my anger begin to rise, involuntarily snapping at him. "I'm not giving it, you dumb son of a bitch. I'm trying to make sure none of us have to fish your—" The words that had been bubbling to the surface died away in my throat, as, for a moment, something behind me had been reflected in the beam of my flashlight. 2 yellow glowing eyes. Instantly, the anger I felt evaporated like water meeting lava, replaced by a sudden bone-chilling surge of pure terror as my breathing shallowed. The same goosebumps I'd felt that night so many years ago covered my arms, and I felt a gigantic shiver fly up my spine. Oh, fuck me sideways. My eyes snapped back towards the old man, who now was raising a dirty bottle to his lips to chuck whatever booze he'd gotten. I spoke in a deadly serious voice. "Fred, you need to listen to me right now. I need you to come over here to me, away from the water." He snorted defiantly again, head still tilted back as he continued to drink, raising one hand to flip me off a second time. Behind him, I caught another flash of yellow, closer this time. I took a few steps towards him, allowing a pleading tone to creep into my voice. "Fred, you can do whatever you want the rest of the night. Hell, I'll get you some more alcohol if you want, but I need you to get the hell away from the water." The man yanked the bottle away from his mouth to glare at me. "I said I didn't want your pity, Jimbo. That includes buying me shit." I began to call again, but as I glanced behind him, anything I could possibly say fled from me as my heart stopped. Behind Fred, less than 10 feet away from him, the yellow eyes glowered at me. Rational thought left me, and I reached down, fumbling with the revolver as I fought to yank it from my pants. As I finally freed it, raising the barrel to the sky, I saw a look cross Fred's face, half fear, half rage. He began to shake in anger. "What, you gonna fucking shoot me?" he bellowed out. For another moment, he stood there, breathing heavily as he glared at me. Then I saw his expression change, as he realized my eyes were no longer on him, but behind him instead. It was as if all the alcohol in his system escaped, allowing him a moment of clear thought. Time seemed to slow down, seconds becoming minutes in my mind. I saw his face fall as his eyes studied the horrified expression that had been carved into my face. I saw the recognition as his own face went pale, as he slowly turned to look down and behind him at the creature, which had now reached out to snatch his ankle in one black, scaly-clawed hand. What happened next happened in an instant. One moment, old Fred was standing up, his face beginning to turn back towards me. The next, he was torn off his feet, slamming face first into the muck. Then he began to flail around, sputtering out disgusting detritus as the creature attempted to drag him backwards into the water. For a moment, I felt rooted to the spot. Then I was charging towards him, raising the gun as it turned to look up at me. Its eyes met mine, and I swear, in that moment, even so many years later, it recognized me. I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins, but still, I dashed forward, dropping the flashlight to the ground as I reached out and seized Fred's hand in mine as I began to try and pull him more onto land. He suddenly let out a horrendous scream, one that shocked me in how high-pitched it was. Raising my eyes from his face, I saw why. The creature had increased its grip on his ankle, its claws digging into and puncturing the flesh. Blood streamed out from the wounds, and it began to yank him backwards. I didn't hesitate. I raised the gun and fired. It did nothing. I fired all 6 rounds straight into that thing's head and chest. Even all these months later, when I try to tell myself that I must have missed, I know better. I emptied that gun, a .44 Magnum at almost point-blank range. At that distance, missing is impossible. And yet, it didn't even react to it. In fact, it seemed to sense that my move had temporarily shifted my focus away from holding onto Fred, and it capitalized on it. It gave the strongest yank yet on the old man's ankle. For a split second, I saw the horrified look on Fred's face as he realized his fate. The next, he was gone. His hand was wrenched out of my grasp, and I tumbled onto my hands and knees in the muck as he was yanked into the water with a loud splash. For a split second, I knelt there, my mind unable to process what had just happened. Then I leapt up, snatching up the flashlight as I aimed the now empty revolver at the water. My breathing came in short, ragged gasps as my eyes darted around, looking for any trace of the man. My flashlight beam glinted off something red drifting in the water, and after a moment, I realized it was a small ribbon of blood. Aside from that though, and the broken bottle which now spilled its contents onto the ground, it was as if he'd never even been there, as if he never even existed. I stood there for a moment longer, the incident replaying itself over and over in my mind as the horrifying implication of it being able to shrug off 6 .44 rounds hit me. And then I saw something which made me turn and begin sprinting towards the ditch, towards the relative safety of my home. I saw the eyes reappear in the dark, coming back for me. I don't go near the water anymore. I'm too afraid now, and the stories I've heard others saying, not just in Bombay Beach, but all around the Salton Sea, fill me with horror I never thought possible. Because there are whispers now of it not just coming out of the water to stalk the shoreline anymore, but coming into the towns themselves. People claim to have seen and heard it stalking the streets, heard its inhuman calls piercing the night sky like a baseball through a window. And what's worse, I've heard them myself, coming from almost directly outside my house. Ever since it learned it's invulnerable to firearms, it's gotten bolder, much bolder. And I'm afraid that I'm the cause of that. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I'm close to finally throwing in the towel, just packing up my truck and running as far away as I can. But not without giving a warning first. You, listening to this, you need to stay as far away from the Salton Sea as you possibly can. I don't care what people try and tell you about how great a place it is for vagabonds and free spirits, about how cool it is to explore the shorelines and see a bygone era in decline, and attend the small festivals that occasionally happen around it. It's not worth it anymore, because that thing that has lurked below the water for God only knows how long is out here, and whether solely because of my encounter with it that night, because of the shrinking water level that is erasing its habitat, or some combination of both, it has become a whole new sort of monster. And the only question I wonder because of that terrifies me. The question that makes me put as much distance between myself and it as possible. If it's like this now, what will it do? If the lake dries up completely.